Hello viewers, welcome to my YouTube channel. Get ready for heart-touching stories. Don't forget to subscribe and let's begin.
I've always believed that dignity is something you carry quietly like a flame cupped in your palms against the wind. You don't announce it. You don't defend it loudly in a crowded room. You simply protect it, nurture it, and when someone tries to blow it out, you find a sheltered place to let it burn brighter than ever. My name is Margaret Elaine Holloway. I am 63 years old, a retired schoolteacher, a widow of 4 years, and until recently, a woman who believed that family was the one place on earth where you were always safe. I was wrong about that last part. The dinner that changed everything, it started at Thanksgiving. My son Daniel had been married to Priya for 3 years. She was sharp, ambitious, and beautiful in the way that makes rooms go quiet when she enters. I had always tried to love her, genuinely tried, though she made it difficult with her small dismissals and polite condescension. She would correct my grammar at dinner. She would talk over me as if my words were background noise. She would tell stories about Daniel's childhood that she couldn't possibly know, filling in the gaps with versions that made me seem foolish or irrelevant, but I tolerated it. I told myself it was generational, cultural, the friction that every mother-in-law and daughter-in-law must navigate. I kept bringing casseroles and birthday cards and quiet love, hoping that patience was the currency that would eventually buy me peace. That Thanksgiving, there were 11 people at the table. Daniel and Priya's house was beautiful, a sprawling suburban colonial that I had helped furnish when they'd first moved in, spending money from Harold's life insurance that I never mentioned because I didn't want gratitude, just love. The meal had been going well enough. I'd brought my sweet potato casserole, the one with the brown sugar crust that Daniel had asked for every Thanksgiving since he was 7 years old. I set it on the counter when I arrived and didn't think about it again. Until Priya cleared her throat during dessert. I should mention, she said, her voice carrying the careful brightness of someone who has rehearsed their cruelty, that I actually remade Margaret's casserole before dinner. The original was a little, she paused, pressing her lips together as though selecting the kindest word from a generous collection. Underdone, I didn't want anyone to get sick. Table went quiet, I looked at her across the candlelight. I've made that recipe for 35 years, I said softly. Oh, I know, she smiled. It just needed a few adjustments, more sugar, less butter. I used a different spice blend. Everyone loved it, didn't they? There were murmurs, polite, uncomfortable murmurs. I looked at Daniel, my son, the boy I had raised through chicken pox and broken bones and the terrible year his father got sick. I looked at him and waited for him to say something, anything. He laughed. It was a small laugh. A nervous laugh, perhaps, but it was a laugh, and it landed on me like a closed fist. Mom's recipe is a classic, he said, but he was smiling at Priya, not at me. Maybe a little old-fashioned. Old-fashioned. I excused myself to use the restroom. I sat on the edge of Priya's pristine bathtub, looked at myself in the mirror above the sink, and made a decision: no more. What they didn't know about me here is what Daniel and Priya did not know. What most people don't know, because I am a quiet woman who has never felt the need to make announcements. After Harold died, I fell apart for about 6 months. Then I put myself back together in ways I never expected. I started painting, seriously this time, not just the weekend watercolors I dabbled in during our marriage. I enrolled in a studio course at the Community Arts Center and discovered that I had genuine talent, not hobbyist talent, but something that made my instructor, a demanding woman named Celeste who had shown work in New York, tell me I was wasting my years in a classroom. I started selling pieces. Small ones at first through a local gallery, then larger ones. Then I was approached by an interior design firm that placed my work in corporate offices and upscale hotels. Within 2 years, my paintings were generating more income than my teacher's pension. I also quietly and without fanfare had become active in our town's historical preservation society, eventually chairing the committee that successfully landmarked 6 buildings downtown. The mayor had given me a commendation. A local journalist had written a profile of me for the regional magazine. My photograph had been on the cover. Daniel didn't know any of this because Daniel rarely called, and when he did, he talked mostly about himself. I listened because I am his mother, and that is what mothers do. But I had stopped volunteering information about my own life somewhere around the time I realized he never asked. And there was one more thing they didn't know. Harold, my quiet, careful, methodical Harold, had been a very good investor. He had never made a show of it. We lived simply, drove sensible cars, took modest vacations. But Harold had spent 40 years carefully building a portfolio that by the time he died was worth considerably more than anyone in the family suspected. More than Daniel suspected, certainly. Enough to make the money I'd spent on their furniture look like a rounding error. I was, by any reasonable definition, wealthy. Not obscenely so, but comfortably, securely, freedom-granting wealthy. I had simply never mentioned it. The months that followed after Thanksgiving, I went home and I got quiet in the way that means business. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't send the usual stream of texts, the check-in messages, the articles I'd clipped, the photographs of things that reminded me of him. I simply withdrew, not angrily, not dramatically. I just redirected that energy toward my own life, which turned out to be richer and fuller than I had remembered. In January, I accepted an invitation to show 12 paintings at a gallery in Asheville. The opening was a Friday evening event, and I wore a red dress I'd bought on impulse in November and then worried was too much. It was not too much. I sold 8 pieces that night and was approached by a collector who wanted to commission a series. In February, I booked a trip to Portugal that I had been talking about taking with Harold for 20 years. I went alone and discovered that solo travel at 63 is one of the more quietly radical acts available to a woman. I walked the streets of Lisbon at whatever pace I chose. I ate dinner at 10 o'clock at a table for one with a glass of wine and a book and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Completely unambiguously myself. In March, I had lunch with my friend Dorothea, who had known me for 40 years, and she said, "Margaret, something is different about you." I told her about Thanksgiving, and she listened without interrupting, which is Dorothea's greatest gift. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "What are you going to do?" "Nothing dramatic," I said, "just live." She raised her glass. "That'll do it." Call Daniel called in April. 5 months after Thanksgiving, I was in my studio in the good morning light working on a piece commissioned by a hotel in Charleston. I wiped my hands and answered because he is still my son. "Mom." He sounded different, younger, somehow uncertain. "I feel like we haven't talked in forever." I agreed pleasantly. "We haven't." A pause. "Are you okay?" "I'm wonderful," I said and meant it completely. "I've been busy. I had a show in Asheville in January, and I just got back from Portugal last week." Silence. "You went to Portugal?" "Harold and I always talked about it. I decided it was time." Another silence. Then, "Mom, I didn't know you were still painting seriously. I mean a show." "MMHM sold most of the pieces. I have a commission now for a hotel project in Charleston." I kept my voice light, factual, warm, not triumphant. "That would have been unworthy." "That's wow, Mom, that's amazing." He sounded genuinely surprised, which told me everything I needed to know about how invisible he had decided I was. We talked for an hour. It was the longest we'd spoken in over a year. Toward the end, he said carefully, "I've been thinking about Thanksgiving. What Priya said about the casserole." I waited. "It wasn't cool," he said. "I should have said something. I'm sorry." I laughed. It was not a perfect apology. It was a small, somewhat belated apology from a man who had needed 5 months and a nudge from his own conscience to arrive at it. But it was real, and I have always valued real things over polished ones. "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate that. We have dinner soon, just the three of us." "Of course," I said. "I'd like that." Dinner they didn't expect. We met at a restaurant in the city, a nice one, Priya's choice, which I took as a small peace offering in itself. I wore the red dress again. When I walked in, something shifted in Priya's face that she couldn't quite control. She had been expecting, I think, the version of me she had catalogued and dismissed. The slightly frumpy widow with the old-fashioned casserole and the eager, self-effacing smile. The woman who could be managed. Instead, she got a woman who had spent the last 5 months becoming more thoroughly herself than she had been in decades. We ordered drinks and made pleasant conversation. Then Priya, being Priya, could not resist. "So Daniel tells me you've been painting," she said, with the faint note of someone humoring an elderly relative's hobby. "I have," I said. "I have a piece in the lobby of the Harrington Hotel in Charleston now, actually." They commissioned a series, 6 panels, 12 feet across when installed together. She blinked. "There's also a collector in New York who's expressed interest in representing me. I'm still deciding whether I want that level of exposure." I said this not to boast, but because it was true, and because I had decided that I would not make myself smaller at this table. "Mom," Daniel said, and there was pride in his voice that made my chest ache a little. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" "You never asked," I said simply and smiled and let it sit there without cruelty. The rest of the dinner was different. I cannot say that Priya was transformed, people rarely are, and I am not in the business of expecting transformations. But she was quieter, more careful. There were moments when I caught her watching me with something that might, given enough time, become respect. After dessert, she said, "That sweet potato casserole at Thanksgiving, Daniel said it's your recipe." "It was his grandmother's first," I said. "She gave it to me when Daniel was born. I've made it every year since." She was quiet for a moment. "Would you be willing to share it? I'd like to make it correctly next time." I looked at her across the table. I thought about the bathtub edge, the small laugh, the long winter I had spent rebuilding something I hadn't known was crumbling. "Yes," I said, "I'll write it out for you." Because I had forgotten. Not because I was naive enough to believe a recipe was an apology, but because I had learned, somewhere in the space between Thanksgiving in Portugal and a red dress and 12 feet of canvas, that the people who try to diminish you are often just people who have not yet understood your size. And I had decided I was done helping anyone underestimate me. What I know now, I didn't plan a revenge. I want to be honest about that. I didn't scheme or strategize or count the days until I could make them see what they dismissed. I just lived. Fully, stubbornly, joyfully lived, and it turned out that was the most powerful thing I could have done. My son calls every week now. We talk about my work and his work and the world and the things Harold used to say. "Priya and I are not close, and we may never be, but there is a wary, growing respect between us that I think we are both tending carefully. And every morning I go into my studio in the good light and I pick up a brush and I make something that didn't exist before. The flame is still burning. It turns out it was never in any danger."